I find from the program that I'm the chair at the book release function. I wondered what the chair for book release function is expected to do. Maybe sit on the book. Anyway, I was once told that the function of a chair is to sit quietly, smile occasionally, and look wise. But I do plan to say a few words, even if it results in your coming to the conclusion that I have little wisdom. The book to be released today is Capabilities, Freedom and Equality. Amartya Sen's work from a gender perspective, edited by Bina Agarwal, Jane Humphries and Ingrid Robeyns. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Robeyns, okay. When Bina asked me to be at this book release function, I wondered if I was the appropriate choice. I'm not an economist, I'm not a feminist, but if I can coin a word, I'm an equalist. And I do believe in ensuring for women and the girl child the freedom to choose and the right to excel. As I've said in my autobiography on balance, I wanted to prove myself as a lawyer in the mainstream rather than take up specific cases and laws pertaining to women. I felt I had first to establish myself to be as good as a man, or better, before I could fight for women's causes with strength. So I waited till my retirement. Not so Bina, who has researched and espoused their cause from the word go, and I admire her for it. So why did I accept her invitation? I think the unstated reason is that it inflated my ego to know that I will be on the dais in the august company of Nobel Laureate Amartya Sen, Professor Nussbaum, Martha Nussbaum, Professor Bina Agarwal, and Mr. Manzar Khan. First of all, let me say how privileged I feel to be here. Bina, as you know, is a professor of economics at the Institute of Economic Growth at the University of Delhi. She has also been vice president of the International Economic Association and the president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. One of her books, A Field of One's Own, Gender and Land Rights in South Asia, has won many prestigious prizes. Mr. Manzar Khan is a distinguished managing director of Oxford University Press, and Martha Nussbaum, you all know, is a great professor and has done wonderful work in the women's field. And Nobel laureate Amartya Sen literally needs no introduction. He has taught for long periods in 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and America, and his ideas and thoughts have permeated the whole wide world. I will tell you an incident about Bina, which explains why I especially admire and respect her. When I was in the Law Commission and we were looking at co-partner rights for women, she contacted me and wanted me to include agricultural land rights for women. I spoke to the other members of the commission, but they were not in favor, and we did not proceed in the matter. However, when the bill was finally introduced in Parliament, Bina single-handedly, or so it appeared to me, motivated and fought and persuaded the legislators to introduce a provision for women's agricultural rights, and managed to get them a field of their own. Of course, implementation of the law is important, and hopefully the law will be a springboard to change the mindset and ensure that women get not only a home of their own, but a field of their own. Professor Amartya Sen, apart from other areas, has definitely and decidedly researched and definitely changed the way we look at development and women's issues. His missing women theory made people sit up and look at the problem of female feticide and infanticide. Sex-selective abortions are still, unfortunately, continuing despite laws that have been passed. And strangely, the affluent society of North India, like Punjab and Haryana, are the greatest offenders. This book, edited by Bina Agarwal, Jane Humphries, and Ingrid Robeyns, has culled out his views on gender and feminist economics. It is multidisciplinary and makes interesting reading, and is important that it should be read by policymakers. I wish it all success and hope it will lead us from gender inequality to gender justice. I would like to add a postscript. Yesterday I went to an exhibition organized by Nussbaum called Poster Women. There were numerous colorful posters dealing with violence against women, dowry death, lack of education and nutrition for the girl child, female feticide, etc. But I was struck by a simple black and white poster. It showed two women trying to dance into this century. It bore the message, there are no paths. Paths are made by walking. I salute the spirit and work done by Professor Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and Professor Bina Agarwal to help us walk. Thank you. I now call upon Bina to make her author's editor's comments. See, I'm not tall enough to go there.
Justice Leila Seth, thank you very much for those very kind comments. Nothing can happen in the women's field without collective action. And anything you attribute to me is really the result of work of really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women over the past more than 50 years. But thank you. All the admiration is all mutually shared, and I'm not sure I deserve it. It's really a great honor to have Amartya Sen with us today, and we also have one of our most distinguished authors, Martha Nussbaum. So I would say we have a double bill. Now there are many descriptions to which Amartya Sen might answer. Social choice theorist, welfare economist, moral and ethical philosopher, development economist. But perhaps fewer know him as a feminist economist. Yet as he himself says in our interview with him in the book, I do see myself in part as a feminist economist, in addition to other descriptions to which I respond, he says. This is partly because of my direct involvement with gender-related issues, but also because of my conviction that the perspective of gender inequality gives us real insights into asymmetries and deprivations of other kinds as well. I'm very interested, he goes on to say, in the works of contemporary feminist economists, and I have enormously benefited from the richness of contributions in this growing field. It is especially drawing on this aspect of Sen's plural identities that my co-editors and I claim him. He's been a friend and a member of the International Association for Feminist Economics since its inception in 1992. Now, of course, Amartya Sen is renowned for his humanitarian approach to economics, but his contribution has also been crucial to several aspects of gender analysis. Many of his writings that you are familiar with have addressed gender concerns directly, but others, even when not explicitly on gender, have engaged with themes which are central to feminist economics and philosophy. But he's done much more. Consistently over at least 22 years, when I first heard him speak actually in this very auditorium, he has promoted the cause of gender equality in public forums, in policy discussions, when presiding over major economic associations such as the International Economic Association, and his early use of the word her rather than him as a sort of generic form when he talks about humankind. So the book being released today is a tribute not just to a brilliant economist, but also to a committed humanist and to a very fine man. Now, in paying this tribute, if you can imagine, standing invisibly beside me are at least three others. My two co-editors, Jane Humphries, who is a professor of economic history at Oxford, Ingrid Robeyns, who's a research fellow at the University of Amsterdam and who was earlier Amartya's student. Also present in spirit is Diana Strassman, who's the editor of the journal Feminist Economics, in which many of the papers in the book first appeared, and who has a foreword in the book. And I'm really sorry they could not be here with us in person. But just to give you a little bit of a taste of how we went about this project, we began this challenging project on a sunny summer's day in London, and we listed all the major aspects of Sen's work, hoping we would cover them all. And our list included justice, freedom, social choice, agency, functions and capabilities, missing women, famines, inequality and poverty measures, the human development approach, and culture and identity. Given this amazing range of topics, we obviously had set ourselves a hard task. And it proved even more so when we found that although many scholars had engaged with Sen's ideas, rather few had done so from a gender perspective. Also, there seemed to be a natural clustering of research, and not just feminist research, around Sen's capability approach and his concepts of freedom and democracy. There was much less on other aspects, and there were few empirical applications of his ideas. So the volume reflects this clustering. However, the book does not only build on Sen's ideas, it also engages with them critically. It not only outlines the usefulness of his work for gender analysis, but it also argues with him. Now, the papers are, as you'll find, both theoretical and empirical. They cover geographic and historical contexts, which are often different from Sen's original applications. And our authors come from many disciplines: economic, philosophy, sociology, politics, history. So in this sense, the book seeks to transcend disciplinary boundaries, as does Sen's own work. And it underlines the amazing range of his influence. Now, there are 13 contributed papers, including one by Sen himself. There's a long interview with Sen by Jane, Ingrid, and myself. And there are 5 of Amartya's earlier papers impinging on gender, which for ready reference. The book begins with Fabian Peter's paper on social choice theory, and this is an area of economics in a sense which served as a launching pad for Sen's academic career in his 1970 book Collective Choice and Social Welfare, which was also highlighted in his Nobel Prize citation. And this contains the seeds of many of his later ideas. Now, what Peter does is she notes that conventional social choice theory is preoccupied with the problem of aggregating individual preferences and does not lend itself easily to themes such as women's agency, women's participation in democratic institutions, and the tensions between the ethics of impartial justice and the ethics of care. Now, Sen, she notes, has a much broader conception of social choice, one which shifts the focus from aggregation problems to participation in public decision-making. Treating people as agents means giving them a chance to be heard and to be involved in collective decisions. And the challenge is to identify ways of enhancing women's participation and influence in policy discourse. Now, Sen's work on social choice already embodied early aspects of his capability approach. And today, this dimension of his work has actually developed a life of its own. In fact, there is a Human Development Capability Association with over 600 members, which meets annually. And of all his contributions, this has most engaged feminist scholars, including Ingrid Robeyns and Martha Nussbaum, who will later talk about her take on the capability approach. Now, several other papers also engage with Sen's capability approach. So, for instance, Vegard Iversen focuses on domestic power imbalances and the interdependencies between individual capabilities. For instance, in a marriage, a woman's well-being outcomes will depend not only on her own capabilities, but also on her husband's. So, to illustrate this, Vegard elaborates on Sen's work on intra-household bargaining and calls attention to little focused capabilities such as bargaining skills in determining bargaining power. Now, the second major clustering of papers is around the issue of freedom. And although this concept is embedded in Sen's capability approach, in terms of an individual's freedom to achieve valuable functionings, as all of you know, Sen went furthest in this in his book, Development as Freedom. Now, several of our authors examine the limits of women's freedom and possibly of the concept of freedom itself. But a particularly unusual take is by economic historian Stanley Engerman. He uses slavery in America as an example. And he suggests that in many contexts, individuals are forced to make difficult choices between physical survival and freedom, one of the starkest being under slavery. Faced with such a trade-off, he talks about how some slaves were compelled to remain in slavery. By analogy, women might end up putting up with domestic violence due to lack of outside options. So to overcome these painful trade-offs, Engelman stresses the need for creative state intervention on many counts. The third theme in several papers is democracy, and for instance, philosopher Elizabeth Anderson explores Sen's treatment of democracy, but she notes that in practice, of course, democracy can fail to correct chronic deprivations in capabilities among significant sections like women, the poor, and so on. And she argues for enhancing women's representation in democratic bodies, something that's been under debate here, and points to its positive effects in fulfilling common social goals. And the fourth and final theme concerns development. There's a paper from Mexico by Butters, Parcher, Marcello, and Garcia, who criticize the popular assumption that fertility-reducing policies necessarily enhance women's well-being. And they demonstrate empirically, saying it much depends on whether women have themselves made the choice. Now there's another paper by Stephen Claassen and Claudia Wink, who revisit the debate on missing women. You might remember that in 1990, in a dramatically titled article, More Than 100 Million Women Are Missing, Sen focused world attention on the fact that in many developing countries, but especially in China and India, there were fewer females than males because of gender bias in families. This is now, of course, widely accepted, but there's debate around what method to arrive at a figure for missing women. And Claassen and Wink, therefore, look at different methods, and they also look at recent data for India and find contradictory trends in sex ratios. So, for instance, they note that female education and employment has reduced gender bias, but there are new technologies which help identify the unborn child's sex, leading to sex-selective abortions. So this has worsened the sex ratio. And finally, we have Sakiko Fukuda-Par, who was earlier director of the Human Development Reports, who gives a historical overview of Sen's contributions to the human development approach. And she argues that gender analysis was crucial to the evolution of the approach. So the book, in this way, illustrates the many ways in which Amartya Sen's ideas have led to a major paradigm shift. It's captured our imagination and it's inspired scholarship across disciplines. But apart from these scholarly papers, we also have an interview with Sen himself. And he, of course, answered all our questions at length with his characteristic combination of fact and wit, with a taste of the personal. So I'll give you just a taster. We asked him if any personal experience had shaped his work on gender. And he answered that among other influences, he said, I had to raise as a single parent 2 children, 10 and 8 years old, when Eva died, through their childhood and teenage years. This learning by doing, he says, directly enriched his understanding of the problems that working mothers face in pursuing careers while looking after children. Again, since the issue of power is so central to studying gender inequality, we asked him this question. We said, many argue that although you have written extensively on gender inequality, you have not directly addressed the issue of power within gender relations. Do you agree? And he replied, I quote, I do not agree with that. I cannot even understand how it could be possible to discuss gender inequality extensively without going into the question of power within gender relations. Power has a central role in what I call cooperative conflict, which is central to my understanding of gender inequality within the family, and ultimately in the society at large. Women and men have both congruent and conflicting interests affecting family living. So in the emergence of some cooperative solution among the many that are available, the powers of the two parties play a crucial role. So the more powerful party can obtain more favorable divisions of the family's overall benefits and chores. Perhaps the point is that, he says, not about whether the concept of power is being used, but about the frequency with which I use the word power, as opposed to the ones I tend to use more often, such as empowerment, capability, freedom, agency, and so on. A Sen's response, of course, provides the basis for an interesting debate, including how the whole issue of power is treated within disciplines. So to conclude, many books have carried papers on Amartya Sen's work, but none, I believe, have examined the gamut of his ideas through the lens of gender. And we hope this volume will inspire others to take the project forward. Of course, there might be a risk in various questions you may be asked, as a question I was asked, which I've shared with Amartya before. a renowned economist asked me jokingly, Bina, you keep referring to Sen's work, but what about us other economists? So I replied, also in a jocular vein, I said, well, as a rational economist, I have to choose the sense over the nonsense, don't I? So let me end by thanking OUP, especially Manzar Khan, Nitasha Devasar, Hemanti Dey, and Robina Kaparat for all their work on the book. I also thank IIC for co-sponsoring this event. And on behalf of the community of feminist economists and other gender scholars, I again thank Amartya Sen for being a friend and for his work which has provided such substantial intellectual challenges and policy shifts. And we look forward to a continuing engagement. Thank you.
I now call upon the publisher, Mr. Manzar, to make a few comments.
Justice Leila Seth, Professor Amartya Sen, Professor Nussbaum, Bina Agarwal, distinguished guests. Today is a very special day for Oxford University Press. We're really delighted actually that we have Leila Seth with us this evening. And contrary to her belief, I feel that she is the most appropriate person to chair or preside this evening's function. I'm sure all of you would know that she was the first woman to be a Chief Justice in India, and whenever it was a long time back, it must have been a huge challenge for a woman. For somebody who has really fought from that platform for justice as a woman, I think she is a really special woman. She's also authored a book, an autobiography of hers, so in no way she's any less for being with us this evening. It's always a privilege to have Professor Sen on any OUP program. The OUP, of course, first of all, he'll be releasing the book, and undoubtedly he is the right person to be present this evening because, as Bina described, that the entire work is based on his writings on gender and an interview with him. So it's indeed really a pleasure to have him this evening. Apart from that, for the OUP, I think we're really privileged, I would say, to have published him. And we've actually published almost all his academic corpus, and it spans over 16 books. And you know, it's very easy to say that you publish 16 books, but to have them all in print, and all in demand and all selling across to students, policymakers, etc., is really a tribute to his ideas and the relevance of his ideas that he continues to command this kind of a respect throughout all his writings, even his Poverty and Famine, which was his first thesis, really stands to sell today, and a lot of people do buy that out. From my point of view, I'm really looking forward to publishing another new collection of his academic essays, hopefully in 2007. And I'm greatly looking forward, I'm using this platform to request him again and looking forward to his contribution to the forthcoming Oxford Companion to Indian Economics. To have a companion from Oxford and not to have an article from him would be a little disappointment for us. Bina has already described the book, so I'm not going to say very much about it. But of course, my gratitude to her and to her co-editors, Jane Humphries and Ingrid Robeyns, who I'm sure must have worked really hard. Although you can go on praising Professor Sen, but to get him to work on, because of his busy time, I'm sure Bina must have been an exceptional person to get him over. I think we all have to congratulate her to get him to. And I know this evening we were having a cup of tea and he referred to her as the boss. So I know she's eventually succeeded to get him on such an important topic, and which is so important for India, because you know, we are growing economically, we are an economic power, we want to grow, but it is so important to have our women equality, our women power growing as well, so that the country can sustain. And I will not tell you anything about the book. I just want to say a few words about the making of the book. As you perhaps have seen already, it is a big book and required a lot of coordination across several continents. It was during the production of the volume that we saw an untiring Bina Agarwal, who was so closely involved as one of the editors, who was based in India, and that she spent long working hours working with the OUP editors, which really helped in the fruition of this volume. So a lot of credit goes to her. From a publisher's point of view, I'm personally delighted that we finally have her in our corpus of authors. Welcome, Bina. And I'm really looking forward that we will have more to work with her in the future. And of course, she's a contributor to the Oxford Companion to Indian Economics, which is, of course, a delight. Finally, I think for the OUP, which is a department of the University of Oxford, it is indeed excellence in publishing that matters more than anything else. And I think this book really stands out very close to our objective. We're really delighted to having published this book. And I'm sure, given the relevance of this subject, it will be bought widely. I can tell you right here that the first edition is already sold out. We are going to put in a reprint after the formal release, so it is really a good omen. Thank you all. I thought you have a very nice program awaiting you. I shall close here and say thank you.
I now call on Professor Amartya Sen to release the book and make some comments.
Hey, will you pull it out?
Okay. Wasn't you I'm extremely grateful for the occasion as well as the event, namely the publication of this wonderful book, for which this is the occasion. And I'm really grateful to you for coming here. I see it described as an afternoon with Amartya Sen. I can tell you I've spent many such afternoons, and they're uniformly boring, unless relieved with other company. And happily, I have excellent company today. And I can't think of anyone whom I would have liked more to chair over this meeting than Leila. In fact, it wasn't entirely a coincidence in the sense I specifically requested Bina whether she might agree to do that. I wasn't certain that she would, so I'm really so delighted she did. And I must say also, her autobiography on balance is an absolutely wonderful book, which I do strongly recommend everyone. I've forgotten now, are you publisher of that one? What? Anyway, no, I see, okay, I'm sorry. I'm straying into difficult territory there. Yeah, on balance, it's a great book, really. And really, as a leading public intellectual, as a legal thinker, and an inspirer of many of our ideas on equity, Leila occupies an extraordinarily important position. So it's very, I feel very privileged, as I'm sure Bina does, to have her in this meeting. I also have the great company of others, including Martha Nussbaum, whose contributions to this whole line of analysis, including my own thinking, of course, is immense and is acknowledged everywhere. And I'm so glad that she was able to come. and of course Manzer for publishing it. I'm very pleased that this book is coming out by OUP, since my other book, like Leila's, unfortunately just coming out now, called Identity and Violence, is published by Penguin. Manzer always seems to treat it as some kind of a polygamy. So I'm pleased at least something is happening with OUP right at this moment. Which brings me to the book, which I think is an amazingly fine collection. Given the difficulty of the subject matter, I'm particularly impressed that sense could be made of the variety of subjects I tried to dabble in, and the contributions are excellent, and even that interview to which she referred was so well thought out. I mean, it's probably the best interview I've ever had the opportunity of giving, where the questions were thought out and brought out what I wanted to say without being quite clear that I did want to say it. So I'm very grateful to Bina for that and for the excellent editing work, along with, of course, Jane Humphries and Ingrid Robeyns. Ingrid I had the privilege of having as a PhD student, Jane as an old friend when she was in Cambridge, and then of course she moved to Oxford. She came to Oxford just after I'd left, but I visited her a few times in Oxford since then. And of course Diana Strassman, the editor of Feminist Economics, which really had been very strongly involved in this collection of works. Unlike Leila, I do see myself as a feminist thinker in some ways, but it relates to this other book, the non-OUP book, as it were, namely Identity and Violence, that we all have many identities. So, just as it's the same kind of dilemma we face when they say, are you a global citizen or citizen of India? The answer is absolutely both. It's like saying, are you an economist, or are you a man, or are you an academic? Are you an Indian citizen? Well, I'm all those things, and feminist economics is a very big part of that. And I was going to say maybe one or two remarks, but I don't have to, since Bina read out very kindly what I said as to why I think the feminist economics angle is very important, because that is important both because gender deprivation, gender inequality is important, but also because inequalities are so interlinked in the world that studying one kind of inequality, and in some ways gender inequality, is probably the hardest of the inequalities, even in some way harder than class. There's a real competition there, and that gives us basic insight into the nature of inequality that we face in the world. And so I'm very pleased that the feminist aspect of my work has been brought out. Since my name finishes with A, in America, when I was publishing things in journals on feminist economics, it was often assumed that I must be of the right gender. I did get a lot of letters saying, "Dear Ms. Sen." And I think one occasion I remember, I think I told that to Leila when I saw her last, that one of the occasions I opened a letter which began by saying, "Dear Ms. Sen, they will never understand." It certainly made my day. But in the many different things with which I feel strongly associated and involved, the nature of feminist thinking, and they really have been immensely creative. Often the world has not fully recognized how creative the feminist thinkers have been across the world. Some of them consciously, I think in Leila's case, unconsciously began but I think I see this work not only connected with my own writing, but also my celebration of the writings of the feminist perspective and all the other people who have greatly contributed to my understanding and the understanding of others to this. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
So this concludes the first part of the program, and I now hand over the mic to Bina And I think Professor, I mean, some other time I would now say, no, are you sure? Yeah.
And the exciting part of this of today's event, which all of you, I'm sure, have been very eagerly waiting for, which is a conversation, perhaps a debate between Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum on key aspects of their work. And firstly, before it's very rude of me, I must thank Justice Leila Seth and Manzur Khan for their comments. And Leila ji, I've been a very long admirer of her work and known that long before I knew Vikram's work. So thank you very much for that. I believe I need say no more about Amartya Sen, but I'd like to say a few words about Martha Nussbaum, for those of you who may have missed her stimulating talks in India. Martha Nussbaum is Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. And she holds honorary degrees from 27 institutions in America, Europe, and Asia. It's actually impossible to summarize the range and breadth of her writings or to convey the high stature she holds among philosophers and legal scholars internationally. But let me highlight a few points. In her 24 books and 240 articles, Martha seamlessly weaves philosophy, literature, and issues of legal and social justice, in particular gender justice. Is that okay? And her book titles reveal her range. Just to read a few: The Fragility of Goodness, which is on Greek tragedy and philosophy; Poetic Justice; Sex and Social Justice; Women and Development, Human Development; and most recently, Frontiers of Justice, Disability, Nationality, and Species Membership. She set aside her girlhood dream of becoming an opera singer in favor of philosophy and academics. So I think the world lost a good potential opera singer, but gained a brilliant and committed thinker and writer. Martha has been a long-standing friend of India. She visits every year since the 1990s. And she's been described, just as Amartya Sen has been described by a fellow economist as the conscience of economics, so Martha has been called a lawyer for humanity. And she's also what we term a public intellectual. She frequently takes positions on controversial items with great daring. And let me say, she's perhaps as much written about as she has written, including in Time magazine, the New York Times magazine, and so on. Now, she and Amartya have co-authored articles, they have co-edited books, as well as debated ideas over a decade, agreeing often, disagreeing sometimes. In particular, she has engaged extensively with Sen's capability approach, and also used the approach to pursue a somewhat different project on social justice and constitutional law. In fact, there's an entire body of work which is devoted to her version of the capability approach. So I thought what we could do is take some key concepts of the work of Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum: capabilities, freedom, democracy, and identity, which occur in both their writings. And although their approaches are both similar and different in interesting ways. And it seems to me it's really a great privilege to have two brilliant thinkers who could reflect on these themes together from a gender perspective. So I thought what we could do is perhaps have an hour of conversation around these concepts, and which would leave about, perhaps not a half hour, but maybe we'll play it by the year, with substantial time with interaction with all of you. What I thought I'd do, if that's okay with you, is to pose some issues first to start off the conversation, and might intervene from time to time. I thought we might begin with capability.
Continue to sit here, you think?
What would you suggest?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
You could remove the flowers.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Flowers are always a problem.
Is this comfortable? Okay, is that fine? Okay, good. Great. Sorry, I've got water all over here. I thought we might begin with capability, since that's such a core concept in Amartya Sen's writing since the 1960s. And it also links with other ideas: freedom, democracy, identity. Indeed, as a foil, today we are celebrating India's economic growth, and the capability approach is actually a very critical reminder of the inadequacy of growth alone as an indicator of people's well-being. What matters, Sen insists, is not growth per se, but people's capabilities, their freedom to do what they have reason to value. And this includes economic, social, and political freedoms. Now, gender-based deprivations are central to his discussion of capabilities. Now, many people associate your capability approach mainly with the human development indices, with which, of course, it is associated. But your concept of capabilities is much more foundational. Indeed, one might call it a paradigm shift in social evaluation. Now, you propose that the capabilities approach is superior to many other forms of social evaluation, such as utilitarianism, social contract theory, and even some accounts of human rights. And I wondered if you might elaborate on that in relation to gender inequalities. And I might pose that, Martha, I know that you agree with this core superiority of the capability approach, but you also have a somewhat different take on it. And in your recent book, you argue that capabilities is a good way of thinking about equal citizenship of people with unequal power. So I hope you will tell us a bit about that as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's a very good and difficult question. I really do think that the beginning of our understanding of this has to be not with capability, but with something more basic like freedom. And it's really a perspective where you emphasize freedom. If you think about big ideas, there's needs, well, think of Marx and Critique of Gotha Program, contrast between needs and work as two reasons for entitlement. Marx in Critique of Gotha Program, one of his last works, comes out in favor of the needs. On the other hand, if you look at early Marx, the particular focus of attention, not only in the philosophic and economic manuscript of the 1840s, but also later works like German Ideology, you find a kind of great focus on the perspective of freedom. And I think that is not the same as the perspective of needs, because when you take human being as being needy, it's quite different from the view that a person can be seen as having the right to, or it's important to see the person should have the freedom to exercise his or her own choice. And what importance he or she wants to give to his own or her own needs must depend on how she judges that situation. Now that is, in a sense, a kind of deeper analysis. I was persuaded later, maybe Martha will comment on that the two personal figures that influenced my thinking on that, initially, namely Smith and Marx, were both very influenced by their own classical reading of Aristotle in particular. Martha could comment on it, but I know, and partly from learning from Martha and then following through it, that Marx's own PhD thesis, for example, was on Epicurus and Democritus, and he's critical of them both in what, on later imperfectly translated reading, it seemed to me there was something Aristotelian about that critique. Perhaps you can comment on that too. But I thought that this is a very different perspective. So if you think entitlement to what you have produced, work, right to what Marx called bourgeois right in the Critique of Gotha Program, there's the importance of needs, but there's also the importance of freedom. So in some ways, I was persuaded in my later work, not in my early work, that really that perspective is really the most important point to begin with. And the book that you kindly referred to, Developing Freedom, is really an attempt to do that. But in between, beginning with my Tanner lectures in 1979, I pursued that. It was in an article called Equality of What. And that was, for me, a kind of organizing principle to think about other subjects. Now, capability comes out on this. Freedom has many different aspects. And one of them is what we may call the substantive opportunity a person has to do certain things which he or she would have reason to value. Now, if you're thinking of capability in that form, it could capture freedom, certainly, freedom as real opportunity. But as I tried to discuss in an intermediate book that came out in 2002 called Rationality and Freedom, that freedom could be seen in other perspective also, like the perspective of being treated as equals. To bring out the tension in it, for example, if we know from what we do know about biology now, that if men and women get equal care and equal medical attention and equal social concern, women tend to live longer than men. Now, if you're looking for capability equality, then that would worry you. And indeed, you may even be tempted to provide less service, fair health service to women, to bring about equality on capabilities. And yet, that would violate something, namely you're not treating women as equals, not having the same right to care and medical attention when you're ill that men should have. So there's a real tension between treatment as equals in this case and equality of capability. So while capability is extraordinarily important in my judgment, and so much of my work have been concerned with that, I do want to emphasize that I don't really think it to be the only issue that one be concerned with. And as far as women's, most of the issues with which women's inequality, women's deprivation are concerned, are well captured by capability, but not all of them is the point that I'm trying to make here. And I think I will have a little bit more to say on the other themes you have discussed, democracy and identity, but I think I'll leave it like that. And I'm not sure that Martha and I entirely agree on that. So much of my thinking has been influenced by what Martha has told me and the critique she has made, but I'm also delighted about the disagreement we have. We had a peculiar meeting last December of artificially constructed identities. There's a group, very often we are called to meetings of Nobel economists. I can't think of a more arbitrary classification in the world than that. I mean, you don't feel kinship ties connected with that. We do, but I sometimes do end up in such a meeting, and I did. And one of the fellow Nobel economists mentioned that he disagreed with me, which was an interesting remark to make. He said, disagreed with me because he doesn't think, he does think that discussion is very important, but he didn't think that debates and disagreements are good things. Now, since that was the disagreement he expressed, another person who was present, whose name I can now reveal since I have positive things to say about him, was Gary Becker. And I said that how much I enjoyed the fact that Gary and I have never agreed. And I asked Gary Becker whether I could rely on the fact that we will never agree. And he promptly got up and assured the audience that there's not the slightest danger that we will end up agreeing. I'm really delighted. So I found both my agreements with Martha as well as disagreements extremely productive for me. So thank you for coming here.
Well, on that note, yes, we do have a disagreement on freedom, and I want to get to that soon. I should say that since I'm from the University of Chicago, I spend a lot of my life in disagreement, and I was teaching a course once with Judge Richard Posner, a leading neoliberal, and the student evaluations came back and they asked, what do you like about this course? And one of them wrote, the wonderful entertainment of watching the professors fight. So we hope that there'll be a little of that entertainment here. Let me describe first what my project has been, because as Bina said, it's a project that's rather different. It connects with both political philosophy and constitutional law. I wanted to use the idea of capabilities as a central building block of a minimal theory of social justice, that is an account of what any decent society will extend as fundamental entitlements to each and every citizen. And so the account is given in terms of certain key fundamental capabilities, and the focus of the specific analysis has always been on gender equality. So of course the idea of capabilities isn't the only idea you need to use if you're building a theory of justice that could perhaps be a basis for constitution making. Very central to my theory has also been the idea of human dignity. The capabilities that are going to be central in my view are the ones about which we can say that if someone doesn't have them, then they don't have the minimum conditions for living a life with human dignity. And so in that way, my thinking intersects a lot with Indian constitutional law and South African constitutional law and so on. I also have the idea of a threshold. That is, what we want is not complete equality, but a certain ample threshold level for each and every person of these capabilities. And then finally, because we are talking about justice for people in traditionally unequal positions, we have to say quite a lot about content. What are the ways that we want to transform institutions such as the family, the role of religion in society, and so on. So a lot of my analysis is occupied with that. But now to freedom. I think, and especially when you're thinking about people who are highly unequal, traditionally, this idea of the perspective of freedom doesn't seem to me to make very much sense, because I'm free to do something that is really free, only if you are going to be restrained if you try to interfere with me. So freedom and constraint are hand in hand, and that's what law is actually all about in the world, is stopping people from doing things to interfere with other people. Even the most ardent neoliberals, such as my friend Posner, think that society has to constrain certain kinds of freedoms, like the freedom to commit fraud and the freedom to use force and so on. But I think any society that's going to pursue gender justice has to not favor freedom across the board, but to think which are the most important kinds of freedoms, how can we extend them to everyone on a basis of equality, and what kinds of constraint will that involve on traditional practices? And take women's equal employment opportunities. Now, if women are going to have equal employment opportunities, then first of all, employers have to be prevented from discriminating on grounds of sex, of course, race and disability and other things too. And also traditionally loved practices, which males often cherish as a part of male freedom, such as sexual harassment, have to be curtailed, and there have to be laws against that, and the police have to actually come and stop it. The right to have intercourse with your wife without consent in the bosom of the family is something that has to be constrained by law, and the police will have to come into the household. So, I don't think constraint is a bad thing, because power can't be stopped without it. And so I think the question we really need to ask is, which are the most important freedoms? How do we stop people from interfering with those? And just to end on a historical note, I think Aristotle is like a Rorschach blot, that you can see in Aristotle so many different things that you like or don't like. But my version of Aristotle is strongly influenced by the British socialists Green and Barker, who were campaigning against child labor and in favor of compulsory free public education. Now what they were saying, of course the parents were saying, this is our freedom to send our children to work, to augment our income. And Green and Barker were saying, no, because human beings can't be meaningfully free and equally free unless law constrains that practice and introduces a form of compulsion, namely compulsory education. So if you'd like to respond to that.
I think there are two points I want to clarify there. You mentioned even Posner, despite being neoliberal, whatever you might describe him as, neoconservative. I'm not quite certain what the definition is.
In America, you would use the word libertarian.
But I don't think he's libertarian in the sense of Bob Nozick. No, not really. I think if you think about real libertarians like Bob Nozick, who was actually opposed even to the draft, I don't think Posner would have taken the same position. So I'd see that as a neoconservative rather than as a libertarian position, but that's a side issue that's overlooked at. But that to say even Posner indicates as if he is really taking freedom seriously. We know that in order to cultivate freedom, you have to do a lot of interventions. You need public education, you need public health care, and even someone who is often taken to be a great guru of the free market economy, namely Adam Smith, had extensive things to say on that subject. As he said on one occasion, for a little expense, the state can provide the means of, and indeed compel every human being, every child, no matter what the family thinks, to receive education. And the argument is that that would be important for the freedom of the child when child grows up. And bearing the perspective of freedom in mind, you may have to go against the right of the parent when they think that education doesn't matter. Now that, by the way, I ought to mention that none of the studies we have made in India indicates it at all a reason why illiteracy survives. I think parents are very keen on it. Every study indicates that, from Probe to the report that the Patishi Trust we make, which I was very privileged to set up with my Nobel money in India and Bangladesh, and our education studies bring up. While schooling is an enormous problem, the parents' unwillingness to send children is really very, very minimal anyway, including girl child. But that, insofar that is an issue it is addressed, but it's also an issue on which Smith is speaking, namely that the state has a role to expand freedom of people by supportive actions. Now that, of course, the neoliberal perspective often misses out. So I wouldn't accept even Posner, because I think they may miss out an enormous amount of freedom-oriented policies, because freedom requires positive action as well as negative restraint. The second point I want to make is that I don't doubt that causally, in order to lead to the realization of freedom of some, who is threatened with interference by others, you may have to restrain the others. But I don't think you celebrate the restraint as such. You celebrate the restraint as an instrument for being a way of getting to the freedom of the person who would otherwise be restrained by these people. So you're replacing the restraint that will be imposed by these other people, interferers, people with greater power, and here power comes hand again, landlords in societies in which they're extremely powerful. When people have unequal bargaining power in the industrial world, and when bureaucrats are immensely powerful, you might have to want to impose restraint on it, but you don't say, my God, how lovely we are having these restraints. You say we need to have these restraints in order to have the freedom of the people whose freedom would be otherwise interfered with. So I'm not disputing at all that constraints are a very important part of a freedom-based perspective. But these constraints are not celebrated as things of importance in itself, but as being causally necessary for the pursuit of freedom that's needed. That, I think, is the distinction.
Yeah, well, I agree with that up to a point, but I guess I think that, look, what you are doing when you're constraining is you're telling the person, you can't do just what you want. And so you are, in fact, limiting their freedom. You're saying your freedom to beat up your wife is not one of the ones that we value. So in effect, you're evaluating freedoms, and you're saying the woman's freedom to her bodily integrity is more important than the man's freedom to beat her up. And so I think inevitably you're going to be involved in the exercise of saying some freedoms are important and some are less important. Some may be positively bad. And you wouldn't exercise great efforts to protect people's right to drive in a car without airbags. In fact, now they can't do that if they want to, but you wouldn't think, oh, this is one of the freedoms that we have to go to great lengths to protect, so we better get the police after the automakers and get them to take out the airbag. No, because you think that the freedom to drive around in a car without an airbag that protects you in crashes is not a genuinely important freedom. It's silly. It's something that actually quite a lot of Americans like, the bravado of driving around without seatbelts and airbags and so on, but they're silly. And so I think you have to evaluate freedom, saying that some are important, some are trivial, and some may be positively bad, such as the freedom to beat up your wife.
Yes, do that. Can I throw one additional thing in? And perhaps you could take a vote.
I forget what one.
Well, go ahead then I'll put my
I promise to repeat. I know that you want to move on to other issues.
no, also on this.
Just because what she said, it was such a rich comment that I should really engage with that, because she raised three very important issues there. She raised three very important issues. I'm not going to repeat what I said before that, whether you're not heard it. Thank you. I think she, when you say, look, we're going to restrain your freedom because we don't think that is important, I think the person whose freedom you're restraining, I would argue in every case, is entitled to ask why. Because any restraint, I would say, has to be justified. Now, it can be justified, and the justification in this case would be that unless you restrain your freedom in this way, whatever it is, the woman's right to have what she would like to have in her life is interfered because of your overbearing rule over that situation, which is a very important issue in the gender thing. But the right of the person who is being restrained to ask, why are you restraining me, seems to me a very basic right, and that's part of the freedom-oriented view, to which there could be an answer, and there is often an answer, but that answer has to be given. Now, the second point of importance you said, and I agree with that there's always a need for judging relative importance of freedom, and that's certainly true. And that applies in this case when you constrain someone's ability, you know, to, I don't know, to have domestic violence. You're saying you're constraining a person's ability to beat up his wife. On the other hand, you are pursuing the freedom of the wife not to be molested. So that being the case, you're judging freedom. But then that general issue applies in all kinds of cases, and it comes up in many different ways across the world. Now, and because we are in a business, and my book on development and freedom, I try to go into it quite extensively, that there's no way, just as we have to judge the relative importance of commodities in the traditional neoclassical concentration of economics, one good against another, and not necessarily, in my judgment, one should be guided only by market prices, though that is an indication. Similarly, the question of relative importance of freedom undoubtedly would arise, and there's no way of escaping that. But in that context, you may have sometimes the linkage is very quite distant. One of them is raised by the question that you mentioned about airbags, or seat belts has been a more classic thing. I think airbags is a harder issue for people to come to grips with in Delhi probably than seatbelts might be. But the seatbelt context, what's the argument? Why force people to have seatbelts? Now, I have to say many American states don't constrain that. I'm in favor of compulsory seatbelts. And that in some ways there is a difference between, it's an issue that John Ernst, Jerry Cohen and others discussed, that post hoc and pre-hoc, there are real differences between the ways you look at it. Now I know I should have worn a safety belt. So the argument takes somehow the counterfactual thing. Would you really, under those circumstances, take the view that it was a mistake for you not to pursue it? Now, I know that thereby there might be a slippery slope there, but that's the issue, one issue. And the other issue is, and that's from a social and economic point of view, is very important. Every time one has a person has an accident in a car, it imposes costs not only on oneself, but on the society at large, especially in societies where there are health services which would treat this person freely or would provide relief. So in some ways it's not the case that no one's interest is at all affected. The other people's interests are affected because it establishes cost demands which may have to curtail other users of that resource. So it's the complexity that we're dealing with. And I'm happy to lead the subject, but I think you're right to point out it's a much more complex problem than a kind of one-sentence summary would provide. And if that one-sentence summary, like emphasizing the importance of freedom, appears misleading, I plead guilty to that, but I would still say, as a one-sentence summary goes, is as good a beginning as any I can think of.
Well, let me link it up in a different sort of way, because it seems to me that there are some missing actors here, for instance, institutions. So, for instance, when you talk about people having seat belts or bill against domestic violence, implicitly the state is a silent actor. It's somewhere there. You also talk about constitutional law. And I wonder if I could pose it in this way, that there is, who decides whether we have X person or X set of people have a set of freedoms or not? I mean, there's an issue of citizens' bargaining power vis-a-vis the state and your ability to shift laws in a certain direction. And that brings us to the whole issue of how democracy functions. I know that both of you place a very strong value on democracy. Amartya, you give a universal value to democracy. But I know you also both support the idea of democracy beyond majority rule and voting to much more substantive ideas, what political theorists might call deliberative democracy, which is the ability of government by discussion among equal citizens. Now, we know that as an idea that's very attractive, but what is also true is that in practice, if you take not just countries like India, South Asia, most countries, the United States even, less than 8% of the women in parliament are women. Of course, in India, we have one-third reservations, so we have more women in the panchayats. But it seems to me a much more serious challenge lies in the fact that women, especially poor women, suffer persistent economic deprivation, and it seems that their voices seldom get heard in framing public policy or in broadening the space of their freedoms. I would like both of you perhaps to reflect and tell us on what you think might be needed for countries like India to move towards democracy where poor women have more voice and choice and more substantive freedoms, if you like, in whichever order you like.
Well, okay, first of all, I want to say that I'm interested in constitutions, and I do think that constitutions play a very fundamental role in ensuring that certain fundamental entitlements are not subject to the whim of majorities. And I think the evolution of Indian constitutional thinking has shown us a lot about how certain basic features of the Constitution can be insulated from that kind of whim of majorities, who are, of course, often enacting traditional power interests. But of course, law can only go so far, and so there has to be a lot of thought given to how public policy can deal with the situation that, I mean, I think one of the ways that you and I may differ is in our fundamental picture of what's going on, in the sense that I think you think of people as in wanting to exercise their freedom, and then the question is, why would anyone stop that? And I guess my fundamental picture is that certain people, namely women, are sinking under various burdens, the double day of housework and childcare, the burden additionally of caring for aging parents, and because they have these heavy burdens that are thrust upon them by tradition and by male power and so on, something much more affirmative and interventionist needs to be done in order to put them in the position where they can just say, yes, I have my freedom and I'll go out and exercise it. And so let me just take the case of care labor, because I think this is a really fundamental and growing problem for India, but for every modern democracy. Here are women, as Nancy Falbray said, it's like a race in which some of the people have one leg tied up with a rope, and how are they going to run along in the race? And women, of course, are often blackmailed into this kind of double day because they're doing it allegedly out of love, so their very sentiments are enlisted and corrupted in the process of oppressing them in this way. Now here, I guess I think one thing that can be extremely helpful is political intervention. The one-third reservation in the panchayats has certainly resulted in a lot more attention being given to problems of care and child care. So we can see that empirically now. But I also think that very specific policies, such as mandatory parental leave, family and medical leave, all these policies that have been tried in various countries are quite crucial, but also direct state provision of care for children and care for the elderly, which is an increasing problem. Care for people with HIV, AIDS is a growing problem of care in India and Africa. So the state can do a lot to take the burden off women if the state provides directly for nursing services and other forms of paid care, so the women aren't in the position of being unpaid laborers for half of their working day. And then finally, I think a lot of the burden falls on the employers, and the state can do a lot to give incentives and mandates to employers so that they don't penalize people for being part-time workers at certain times of their life, for assuming a burden of care. In my own country, young law students that I teach know that if they go to a law firm, they can't have children and they can't care for their elderly parents because of the demands the employer makes, which are not there's no public policy that countermands that says this is incompatible with gender equality. So I think that the state can intervene at a number of different points. A final place is in the content of public education, where let's hope that at an early stage, boys learn that it's not undignified to do housework. I've seen NGOs. I remember a very fine NGO in Bihar, the late V.G. Srinivasan's NGO Aditi. We visited a young men's group where they were learning that housework was a dignified male activity. But you know, this is very hard. It has to be much more systematic. It can't just be one NGO in this or that village, but it has to be something where the whole public sector takes a stand on the content of education across the board, if anything of this is going to succeed.
I agree with what you say. And I just add 3 things to it. One is that even though women's lives would be often standardly restrained, like you mentioned that your law student is going to take a job in a firm, probably a very high-paid job also, will nevertheless have the constraint of not being able to produce children if they want to then. And I think that restriction of freedom, I think the first thing for someone to do in this context is to note the fact that this is a restriction of freedom, and this may be something one would like to rebel against. So unless that recognition comes, one does not even say what it is one is fighting for. So if I want, in the form of a kind of, not so much a battle cry, but as a basic principle, freedom, to say that whenever there is a violation of freedom, we have reason to ask, is it necessary and why is it the case? And so I would say that there's no conflict between what you said and what I was trying to say. The second point, I would say that this question about why is very central. So in some ways, even if freedom is very central to my own thinking, I think being argumentative, which was the subject of my book in the specific context of the culture I grew up in, namely India, is even more foundational in some ways, that every time anything is suggested to that, to ask the question why is a very good way of reacting to anything. And I think that question comes up. And one of the problems I found when I first started working on gender in 1960s, when I was a professor at Delhi School of Economics, and I must say, in that hostile period, it's a good moment to recollect it. I mean, think Bina's work and other people's work have changed the picture. But in that time, this was treated as such an eccentricity in the late 60s. And basically, I was told that, you know, we love you and it's an amiable eccentricity. But you're taking it away from, the left would say, from class, which is very central, and anything that distracts attention to unifocal interest in the class is a mistake. And the right would say, what the hell is the problem? There's no real issue, and indeed, as several of my colleagues in the school itself did point out that if you asked an Indian woman, you know, whether she is being badly treated, she wouldn't even know what you are talking about, because she doesn't think of it in individual terms. She thinks of it in family terms. If you ask, how are you, they would say, family is doing well. Now, to me, that is a basic denial of freedom to think about yourself as an individual. And, you know, no matter how much rhetoric might come my way by describing, saying that you're an individualist, don't take society seriously, I think that's a whole lot of rubbish, because the individual belongs to many different groups. And one of them is a particular grouping in which you yourself is involved, which is not a family group, right, which distinguishes the opposition with others. So I think this questioning of why has been, you know, in my judgment, is very central to that, and it's become easier to ask now. The third point I wanted to make is about the state, and I think it brings out the why question. You see, the state have all kinds of reasons for interfering, but all kinds of reasons for not interfering either. And I think to ask the question, is this the right kind of intervention, is extremely important. I think not asking the question has cost India a lot. Because, you know, India has this great image of having been, quote-unquote, a socialist state and now being liberalized. Now, what kind of a socialist state was it where people were not schooled, their health care was widely unavailable and often extremely costly. There was a lack of provisioning by the state on health and education. On the other hand, there was an immense activity of the state in which the state did pretty badly. India didn't go as far as China in terms of agriculture in running the communes, which were absolutely disastrous, and including having a hand in the largest famine in the history of the modern world. 58, 61, when 30 million people died. India didn't have that insanity. But a lot of the industries we were running, a lot of the services we were running, a lot of the hotels I was running, where it belongs to the state. I have not yet stayed in a hotel run by a state in any country, which is halfway decent in terms of services. When I was in Beijing, one occasion I was moved from a 4-star, not 5-star hotel in which I was placed in Shenzhen, where I went there, in a private hotel, and then I was moved. I was told, no, I was a state guest, I must move to a 5-star hotel. It was state-owned, and it was tremendous difficulty for me to do everything. By the way, I have to tell you, do I have time to tell you a quick story?
A quick story.
I had even difficulty in communication because my wife called me at some stage, and she said, from England, saying, you know, the hotel doesn't believe that you are you're staying there. So she inquired, and she said, there is no one called that staying here. So I said, what do you do? He said, well, I've called your friend who was from Hong Kong, as a matter of fact, who had gone back to Hong Kong, which is very close to Shenzhen. And he said, no, I had a drink with him. He was staying in whatever the room is, room number 410. So she called me. And then, so I went to the reception, and I said, you know, you told my wife that I'm not staying here, but I am staying here. So she said, what is your name? So I said, my name is Amartya Sen. And she said, no, you are not staying here. I was terrified. So I said, well, but I have checked in, and I have even, my toiletry is in the bathroom. So, and she said, what is your room number? He said. So I said, 410. And then he looked up and he said, well, there is someone staying there, but it's not you. So by that time I was really terrified. So I said, can you tell me what is his name? And he said, well, his name is Mr. Asian Nobelist. So this for me immediately answered the question as to why I was invited to be the keynote speaker on this conference. But this is actually a mild example, didn't do any harm. But in general, I think the state is involved in all kinds of activities, which is not very good at. And I think the important thing is to recognize the distinction. And therefore the question why is very important. So I celebrate the fact I'm deeply critical of the fact that our education and healthcare has got privatized prematurely. I don't know of any other country, any country in the world, where without having a basic delivery system of public health and public education, in any way private healthcare could have flourished for reasons that Ken Arrow discussed in 1973 in what is often not recognized to be the classic paper on asymmetric information, namely that a patient does not know certain things which a doctor could know. Sometimes when I've dealt with our study, the doctors didn't seem to know very much either. I think the combination of quackery and cookery that goes in the form of private medicine in rural areas in India often produces that result. But it's quintessentially a subject where you do need state action. But we were not involved in that, but we were involved in a whole lot of things in which the state had very little to contribute. So I think the why question is therefore very central.
Can I just say one more? I mean, of course, I come from a different country that's absolutely got the opposite fault if indeed the degree of state action in the economy in India is a fault. But I guess I think what's very important is not to slip over into the attitudes that Americans slipped over to in the Reagan period, where the satisfaction of existing preferences is taken as the benchmark of freedom. Now that's something you've criticized very effectively. And in the context of gender, where you've pointed to the fact that women's preferences are malleable and that they will often grow up thinking, oh, caring for my aged mother is something that I ought to be doing out of love. And so even though the love might not lead quite that far, the woman won't own up to herself that she's unhappy doing this and that she thinks she ought to have different opportunities. So I think it's important not to ask the question, how satisfied are you? That shouldn't be the test question, but it should be a much more, as you say, objective question. What are you actually able to do and to be, and how does that compare? Is that equal to the entitlements of other people? So the notion of equality has to be absolutely central in the way that this question is posed.
Yeah, it seems to me also there's state and state. People can get all sorts of states through the democratic process, as we've seen in recent years, which may or may not uphold the rights of women, minorities, the disadvantaged. So the question of are we assuming a benevolent state, but it need not be. But it brings me, your story, Amartya, brings your hotel story, brings me to the whole issue of identity, mistaken identity, and how do people see us, which hat do we wear? Now, both of you, of course, have written recently, Amartya's book on identity identity and violence will be released on Tuesday, and Martha, your book, you have a book in press on the subject. And both of you, of course, endorse the notion of plural identities as part of India's historic tradition. And also the importance of being able to choose one's own identity rather than having it imposed by birth or in other ways. But then I wonder if you might, both of you take a rather negative view of identity politics. Since your primary concern, it seems to me, is with the narrowness of religious identity. But one might argue that identity politics could also play a positive role. For instance, if you take the women's movement, which is based on gender identities and interests, and which has brought obvious gains. Indeed, one might say that it's been very important, the women's movement, in broadening democracy itself and enabling and broadening the space of freedom for women in this country and other countries. So could you comment on that? The kind of negative aspect of identity you focus on, but also the positive.
Well, I think one of the great things about the women's movement is that on the whole, it has not been tyrannical. It's a movement that, after all, cuts across religious and cultural boundaries and national boundaries and brings women together around common problems rather than common conceptions of their ethnic or religious identity. And so women have tended to be respectful of the differences among them and not to impose. Now, that isn't always the case. I do remember in my own graduate school days when the women's movement was just starting up in America, silly things like women being told that you can't wear a skirt, you gotta wear pants, and otherwise you're not a real feminist. Even you have to be a lesbian and you can't have relations with men. And so a good friend of mine actually committed suicide after she had co-taught a class on philosophy of sex roles with a man, and the whole women's group denounced her and said she had corrupted her students' minds by this kind of cooperation with a man. So there were elements of tyranny in the women's movement, and I think that to that extent it's just as bad as any other. But on the whole and on balance, and certainly here in India, wherever I have been, I've seen that the good women's NGOs are very careful to organize in ways that involve both Muslims and Hindus, people of all different caste backgrounds, that there's an absolute refusal to say, well, there's now going to be a Muslim group and a Hindu group. So that there's a kind of respect for pluralism built into the very way that the women's movement has operated in India, which is what's enabled it to be such an effective voice in the case of Gujarat, for example.
Yeah, thank you very much, and also what you said. Let me add to it also that, going back to the question that you raised, I think it's not only the fact that one is asserting that we have plural identities. I'm claiming that it's the most unremarkable fact about human beings is that we have plural identities. What else could it be? I mean, I'm a I'm an economist, I'm an academic, I'm an Indian citizen, I happen to teach at Harvard, I am a man, I acknowledge to being described as a feminist economist. I have many, many, many other identities. And that, I don't know what life would be like without it. What happens is that when some group generates either violence or disaffection by saying one of these identities, being a Hindu or a Muslim, is the only identity you have, everything else is nothing. I think that's where the problem arrives. So it doesn't arise with us trying to assert plural identities. I mean, when things that people tend to think that you're hazarding the guess that we are plural identities, I think a less hazarded guess has never been hazarded. Actually, I mean, it is absolutely the most common thing. And I think it's the meat of terrorism to argue that. It's the meat of riots. I remember still as a child in the 1940s when suddenly the broad Indian or the broad human being of January was by July a narrowly defined Hindu or a fiercely defined Muslim confronting each other. And what had happened is just emphasizing that identity and overlooking everything else. I think it's very important because the terrorists not only do it today, but those who are fighting terrorism. I think the global war on terror has got into an absolutely terrible start, not only because of what I believe is the mistaken policy in Iraq, which is, really went against all kinds of reasoning, prudential as well as political and moral, but also that the whole problematic of seeing people, that you accept that when Al-Qaeda or anyone came, that the Muslim person has an Islamic identity and that's the only identity, and that is a terrifying, the strong, violent identity. The response had been to accept that that politicization of religion, and then argue, as Tony Blair argues, and very powerfully argues, that Islam is a religion of peace. But then you concede already that the politicization of religion is fine. And then it's a question of defining and redefining Islam. And there have been Islamic kings who have been very violent, who have been, so to say it's a violent religion of peace is absurd. And at the same time, there have been extraordinarily tolerant persons who are also Muslim kings, from Emperor Saladin giving shelter to the fugitive Maimonides fleeing 12th century intolerant Europe to find a place in Cairo, to Akbar doing the first codification of minority rights in the world, to which Indian secularism, I believe, is an inheritor. So I think in all these respects, Islam is a religion, and then along with that religious identity, you have political identity. You could be liberal, you could be conservative, you could be right-wing, left-wing, you could be very violent, or it could be something else. Now, I think trying to capture all this in one has produced this total absurdities, like the term moderate Muslim. Now, what does that mean? Moderate in your religion or moderate in your politics? Now, somebody could be extremely religious Muslim and be extremely moderate and liberal in politics. When Gandhiji and Muhammad Ali Jinnah was having debates here before Indian independence, Gandhiji was extremely religious and quite secular in politics, whereas Jinnah drank whiskey and did not follow many of the Muslim customs, including praying, and yet was strongly emphatic in the importance of the Muslim-Hindu division in the partition of the country. So this whole idea of a moderate Muslim is a confusion, trying to capture in one dimension what is the characteristic of many dimensions. And I think that is such a foundational problem in the Anglo-American thinking in the world today, and to a great extent even in the European thinking. I mean, one of the more ambitious claims I make in the book that there's something for the world to learn, including England and America, Britain and America, and France and Europe to learn from Mahatma Gandhi's ideas and Rabindranath Tagore's ideas, where argumentative Indian was a statement about a country. This is a statement about the relevance of some of the problems we have visited, and sometimes very painfully visited in the past, and which give us some lessons about today's problems in the future. So I do feel intensely strong about asserting the importance of plural identity, and I'm amazed that it has to be asserted, because somehow a basic confusion has taken us away from one of the most elementary recognitions of human life, namely we belong to many, many different groups.
I think, thank you. It seems to me there's everything that Amartya and Martha say, of course, makes you feel that you need to take it further, argue with them. And with that spirit, I'd like to open this up to the audience to give voice.
You have roving microphone?
Do we have a roving microphone? Yeah. So please put up your hands and yes, Zarina Mehdi. Yeah. Please identify yourself and.
I'm Zarina Mehdi. I'm a sociologist by profession and a feminist by conviction. No, you see, can I go back to this concept of freedom? Because of course that I find that I think it is probably very complicated.
A lot?
A very complicated
You have
concept.
to hold it closer. Like
I say the concept of freedom I find very difficult to somehow, ascertain. And I think Martha said that there are freedoms and there are freedoms. I mean, you see, it's not an absolute concept, there is a relative freedoms. And in relating to women's freedoms, one thing I find very difficult to understand these days, India was one of the first countries which gave women the freedom to her body, which resulted in early years after independence, the woman's freedom to abort. Even a married woman could abort a child without the consent of the husband, which was supposed to be, and it is, I think, a very advanced kind of legislation. But now what is happening is that with this growing feticide, the woman's right to abort is becoming very difficult. And I think there are certain, in Europe particularly, certain voices which are saying that should parents not have the right to determine the sex of their children. So in this kind of situation, I wonder what is the role of ethics in determining the freedoms, and on that basis the state intervention. Maybe you would like to come into that. Thank you.
I go ahead, yeah.
You want to start?
Well, first of all, greetings, and nice to see you again. And as expected, it's a very good question. I don't think, if I'm emphasizing the importance of freedom, the claim isn't that it's the simplest thing to pursue. I mean, that is a general problem we face, that some of the most important ideas are extremely complicated. That doesn't prevent us from crying liberty, equality, and fraternity when the time comes, from crying that. And yet, that's not because any of these concepts are unproblematic. I think to say it's important is to say just that, not that it's uncomplicated. And I, for a long time, I had great difficulty, and now this opposition is far less, on the capability to kind of economic work, by saying, no, the market economy gives you a wonderful index. Don't you see market prices give you a precise index, whereas capabilities, and you have to judge different kinds of freedom. My God, what a terrible territory. As if the fact that it's more complicated already means that the uncomplicated but entirely wrong measure would be better thing to do. So I think I acknowledge that it is difficult, but precisely because it's important that we have to pursue those difficulties. And that does not mean that everything will become absolutely clear at the end either. There will remain some issues that have... I have, by the way, a paper coming in, if you're interested, in the Journal of Philosophy, called What Do We Want from a Theory of Justice? And one of the things I'm arguing, we don't want necessarily, we don't insist on that every question which could be asked is A more just than B could be resolved. But that many questions could be thus resolved, and these are many of the things that we are really deeply moved about are resolvable, and we don't hold up answering those questions on grounds that we cannot answer much more complex ones. On the subject of abortion, I think there is a complication. Philosophy and ethics have something to offer there. Because one thing is quite clear, the woman's right to abort, it seems straightforwardly there is that consideration. Now those who argue on the other side are talking about the right of the fetus. That's where the debate is. And that takes us to the kind of territory in philosophy about whether the fetus could be considered to be a human being and whether it does have a right or not, and whether this question can be answered in an unequivocal way. People like Derek Parfit, who has talked about that kind of question, try to emphasize that there's some issues, there will be some ambiguities on that score. So it is a complex question. I mean, I think I do also regret the fact that the right to abort is maybe under fire, and in America it certainly is under fire at the moment. I think on balance that would be my position. But I say that on balance, and I'm quoting the title of Leila's book, which is such a wonderful title, while that's on balance the position, it's not because I don't think that there is nothing to discuss here. There is something to discuss here. And I think it's important for those who are keen on the right to abortion, which women have a good reason to be, to engage in these arguments, rather than simply say there's nothing to discuss. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that, and of course the abortion issue does have such a different face when one thinks about sex-selective abortion, and this is very important to think about. I think one of the questions that can be quite useful is to ask oneself, what's the best the best concept under which to analyze the abortion right, the concept of privacy or the concept of equality? Now, one current in US philosophy and constitutional law has been to say abortion rights are fundamentally privacy issues. That is, they're about a woman's right to control what happens inside her own body. And so the right to abortion is very similar to the right to use contraception, the right to other kinds of bodily freedoms. The other current says, well, really, the issue is not so much privacy, or it's less privacy, than it is an issue of equality, because women alone are asked unequally to bear a burden of life support, which men are not, of course, asked to bear. And if we imagined that there was a law that said whenever someone needs a kidney donation, all and only African Americans would have to donate their kidneys, that law might be wrong on grounds of privacy, but it would certainly be wrong on grounds of equality, because it would single out a group that's already disadvantaged and it would burden them further. So the idea is that if we use this equality analysis, we don't even have to reach this difficult question of the moral status of the fetus, because even if we treat the fetus as a full human being, it's still wrong to impose against a woman's choice, to impose on her a burden of life support that others are not asked to bear. So it's like that kidney donation case. Now, if we think of it that way, then I think we can differentiate. And this is, by the way, I should say that this analysis of abortion, which was referred to by the US Supreme Court, was created by several people, but one of them was Catherine McKinnon, and another was my own partner, Cass Sunstein, so I want to give him credit for that too. Anyway, but this equality analysis helps us see what's especially problematic about sex-selective abortion, because here, the equality thing runs the other way, because it's now a burden on the equality of women to be aborted in an unequal terms. So I think how we see this issue ultimately is very complex. And McKinnon has actually said publicly that if men and women were ever fully equal in society, she thinks it would be okay to criminalize abortion. I don't feel that way, because I feel that there's a privacy right there too. And I think we have to combine the two issues. And that means for me, as for you, it's much more difficult and open-ended. But I think at least to analyze it partly in the space of equality helps us see what's particularly wrong about it, and then helps us differentiate the sex-selective abortion from just another kind of abortion.
I'll take the liberty of entering the conversation briefly. I was wondering if one might also see this within the domain of political economy, because what constrains women's choices? On the one hand, you can have a state which passes laws on whether you can have abortion or not, in the Roe versus Wade debate in the US, and so on. So the state can criminalize or not criminalize. But it seems to me that women's choices are also constrained by social norms, the informal institutions which guide society. And therefore, do women really choose to have sex-selective abortions? Even if they have a right to abortion, they might be still constrained on the basis of social norms. And so both of those one might see the state, which is the formal institution, and social norms, which are the informal institutions, as constraining women's right to choose and freedoms. Would you, I mean, these are my, anyway, some thoughts on that. I'll come back to the floor. Please. Yourself and then Miloon. Could you give the mic to the gentleman here in the second row? Please, please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Raghu Karnad. I'm a student. So I believe that the capabilities approach owes a lot to Aristotle, who I also believe he prescribed a very rigorous training in things like practical wisdom and virtue that he thought would enable us to use freedom well. So if we were to use, I think, is the analogy of this in the political sphere that if we were to open new opportunities with the capabilities approach, we would also need a sort of educational project or to reevaluate how we educate people?
Shall we take more than one, just to add to that? Yeah, Miloon there in the second. Miloon Kothari, and then yourself. We'll take three. Here he is. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm a special rapporteur on adequate housing with the UN Commission on Human Rights, which is now the UN Council. In the debate between Professor Sen and Professor Nussbaum, there was a sprinkling of terminology related to dignity and non-discrimination and ethics. My question is more for the professors, how do you find the relevance of the human rights approach? Because, I mean, in my work, I find it as very powerful, particularly in identifying the state as being the ultimate authority responsible for attaining rights, in creating a very strong moral basis, and of course the constitutional provisions that Professor Nussbaum referred to in South Africa and in India, which are very strongly grounded in human rights, plus the intersectionality approach, the multiple forms of discrimination for women. And I find in the work on economics, there isn't enough of a I don't know if it's an understanding or enough of a sort of basis on human rights which could help us all dealing with deprivation and in fact what I would consider a more sophisticated, deeper analysis of what ails society. So the question is, why is it that the human rights approach is not used more explicitly in your work, and would you find it useful in that work? Thank you.
And the gentleman next to you, so we take those three.
Darpan Majumdar. So my question is to both Professor Amartya Sen and Professor Martha. Professor Sen, you talked about the identity per se, and you said there is no identity is unique in nature, but there is there are various identities which a person has. Now my question to you is that in certain times, there is one identity which comes out very strongly. And for example, if I take the partition of India and Pakistan, that point of time the religious identity came out very strongly. But on the contrary, when we take Pakistan and Bangladesh, then it reflected a linguistic identity. Now my question to you is, there is one identity which comes out more strongly in testing time than other. And the part B is the of language. For example, a person like me who speaks Bengali at home, but when he goes to school he speaks Hindi, and sometimes he comes out and he speaks English. Then the problem of a polyglot is that also gets reflected, because I think I'm not very sure which is my language. So there is also a complexity in terms of what is my language, quote unquote.
How do you want to do these three questions? Capability, human rights, identity.
Say something.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, the Aristotelian question. Absolutely, education is crucial to sustain a just society, and that has to involve certainly training of practical wisdom. But I would emphasize something Aristotle didn't emphasize, that is the cultivation of a way of imagining the situation of other people and sentiments of compassion for the situation of other people that simply are what have failed in America. Now there are sociological studies of compassion in America showing that people simply don't have compassion for poor people because they think they brought their poverty on themselves. So I think John Stuart Mill talked very well about this, about how if you want to create what he called the religion of humanity, that is a decent support for the life chances of every human being, you have to rest a lot of weight on education, but that has to be an education that reaches into the personality quite deeply, and that is something I'm particularly interested in these days. As to human rights, yes, I do talk about this some in my work, and I really did want a chance to talk about it here, so that's great. I think of my approach as a species of a human rights approach, and the reason that I think there are just many different human rights approaches. And so one thing I don't like about some human rights approaches is that they rest on the notion of negative liberty. They take it that rights have been secured when the state keeps its hands off. The US Constitution defines the right of free speech in the following way: Congress shall not make any law impinging on the freedom of speech. So, you know, this idea that rights are secured when the state keeps its hands off, as you see, I don't particularly buy that idea, and so I don't like that approach to human rights, which is very common in my own country. I also think that in the international human rights movement, the distinction between first-generation rights and second-generation rights is somewhat unfortunate, because, I mean, one thing that we've both stressed in the capability approach is that all rights have a material aspect. You aren't really free to participate in politics. You're not really free to speak unless the state has taken affirmative action to make education available and to do quite a whole lot of other things to relieve poverty. So I think that distinction is not very helpful, but in other ways I tremendously applaud the human rights approach. Yeah, I mean, I think we all do have these different identities, and sometimes the local ones come out much too strongly. I think when one's own child is ill, then absolutely everything in the world can vanish from view, and but sometimes in a much less high-minded way. I mean, I remember being at a conference in Japan about justice when my beloved Chicago White Sox won the World Series, and I was deeply angry that I was in this foreign place where no one understood that the White Sox were the most important thing to me in the world. And I retaliated by wearing White Sox t-shirts every day at this conference. Luckily, they were elegant and black and so on. But anyway, yeah, you know, I think what our task is to try to make the affiliation we have to people distant from us stronger. And that is the task of education, in my view, because it's so easy for the local, which is colorful, which is full of love and joy, to take priority over the distant. And so I think it is, what you say, it is so easy for something close at home to loom up very strongly suddenly. And so we need to keep reminding ourselves that we also have deep ties to human beings distant from ourselves.
I can be very brief on the education question. I sort of 100% agree with what she said. I agree with also what she said on the other two questions, but I'd like to add a little bit more to that. On the question that Mr. Mazumdar made about sometimes some identity becomes very important. I think there are two issues there. One is that in some contexts, some identities are much more important than others. I mean, if you're going to a dinner party, then your vegetarian identity is much more important than it would be if you're coming to an economics lecture. And so I think there's nothing remarkable about that. But what happens is when you could have had a competing pool of identities, like in the time of partition of India, Hindu-Muslim, as opposed to, as I was quoting Gandhi was saying in my book, I do discuss a lot, the new book, that the other identities were present very strongly. In 1931, when Gandhiji was in the Round Table Conference in London, he protested that he was being asked to, as being seen as a representative of Hindus, indeed upper caste Hindus. And as the Prime Minister of Britain said, the rest of them will be represented by other representatives of their groups, to which Gandhiji raised the question, without using the word plural identity, exactly that. He said, why that? Of course I'm a Hindu, but I'm also many other things. And if I had to represent anyone, I would rather represent the 85% of the poor, landless Indians who is another group. And I would rather represent them than represent Hindus. And then he turned, Sarojini Naidu was the only woman present. She said that, who had been president of Congress earlier, and he pointed out that Sarojini Naidu was the only woman present. Another way of classifying it, she speaks for 50% of Indians, he said. And And he said, you have had a total repudiation, he told the British Prime Minister, of the special representative when it comes to women. So I think the issue is when such a thing happens, that one identity is played up tremendously, you have to ask the question, are there competing identities which we are overlooking? And that's very important. On the question of the question that Milun Kotari asked, I think human rights is extraordinarily important. I don't acknowledge that it's not important in my work. I feel the same way, that there's very much a presence there in my work. I have a whole paper which discusses why it's important. I don't know whether you've seen it. It's in Philosophy and Public Affairs of fall of 2004. It's called Elementary Theory of Human Rights. And I discuss why it's ever present in our thought. But I think there are two distinctions to be made which have caused an enormous problem by our not recognizing them. One is that the claim to a human right is not a claim to a legal right from which follows a certain coercive implication of the state without any further intermediation. That confusion which Jeremy Bentham made him criticize the French declaration of these rights of so-called rights of man, which included human beings, men and women, by criticizing it. This is the publication in 1791, it's called Anarchical Fallacies, saying that rights are the child of law, and without a legal right, you cannot have any entitlement to right. Now, what she was talking about is really whether human rights translate in the same way as legal rights, and the answer is that it doesn't. But there was a confusion, because the right comparison is that those who were claiming to be, it's a very important part of social ethics, including Mary Wollstonecraft in 1791, same year, a Vindication of the Rights of Women, and her previous book, Vindication of the Rights of Man, Tom Paine about the same time. They were not arguing that they are already legislated rights, they were arguing that these are a very important part of social ethics. The one we're looking at it, if you think of Bentham being two things, one a utilitarian theorist and a utilitarian ethicist, and a legal theorist, he was after all one of the early ones to do the typology of legal rights, he made the wrong comparison. The comparison of the human rights is not with the legal right, but as an alternative claimant to the role of utility as the basis of social ethics. So he missed it altogether. Now the corrections that have come, and most powerfully by one of the persons I admire greatly, and a great friend of mine whom I miss still a lot, a great lawyer in Oxford called Herbert Hart, who argued in his book that human rights, or natural rights as he was looking at, natural rights connected with human beings in the context of the French Declaration, could inspire legislation, arguing that it's not just the child of law, it could be parent of law. Laws could be guided by it. And that again I think is very important, but I would say incomplete, because human rights are practiced, and I do argue in that article, and indeed it's also present in Development of Freedom, that a lot of different ways of pursuing human rights exist. When there is no law, but nevertheless you can shame the authorities by bringing to public notices of things, that there have been tremendous violations taking place of what we accept to be people's acknowledged ethical rights, then people do react. One way of understanding it is that, human rights have a Human Rights Commission has a certain position in India, even legally. In Pakistan, it's a mere NGO. And yet, in the skillful hands of the leadership there, Azma Jahangir, I.A. Rahman, it has been able to achieve a lot of things without legal backing by the fact that Pakistan is also a society with a media where the public opinion makes a difference. People read papers, they get upset when they hear certain things are happening. So I think it's an enormously more powerful canvas on which we have to see the human rights. So I'm very glad you asked the question, though I don't acknowledge that I neglected it. It is very far from it.
Thank you. It seems to me that the best time to close a good conversation is when all parties feel they must talk more and they'd like to meet again and continue. With those last set of comments, I would like to draw this wonderful discussion to a close. As we know, there's a great deal that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have written and said, which one might agree with. There is some that they may have said that one might disagree with, but nothing that they've said would leave us neutral, I believe. Firstly, with those words, let's give them a clap.
May I supplement it by saying that I would like you to join me in clapping Bina for doing the book, for doing the occasion, and planning everything.
Well, which I hope you'll join. We have a desk outside, the International Association for Feminist Economics and the Indian International Center. I want to thank Justice Leila Seth, Martha Nussbaum, Amartya Sen, and all of you.